welcome to another episode of Things They Don't in Florida. And today we have with us Julian Reid on a train in the north of Finland. Julian is professor in international relations at the University of Lapland in Rovaniemi. And maybe when I first got in touch with Julian, international relations sounded a little bit like management people or whatever. But in Julian's case, it is maybe more like a smoke screen to do work where it's not supposed to in a certain way, because Julian's interest is much more in political theory and relationships to biopolitics from a sort of Foucauldian etymology, but moving into much more contemporary attitude. So it's for me, it's a very, very interesting scholarly practice in the sense that it is occupied with the same thing, but in very, very different ways. So from when we came together first, some 10 years ago, Julia's research was very strongly involved in forms of conflict, and particularly war. How does neoliberal circumstances or regimes think about war, etc.? But more lately, his interest has shifted partly to postcolonial and decolonial discourses, but also very interestingly into conversations around indigenous populations and how we understand indigeneity in contemporary discourses. And Julian is teaching, as mentioned, in the University of Lapland, but has a background from the UK, where he did his Ph.D, etc., and has been guest lecturer and researcher in different universities, both in the US and in different locations in Europe. And he has published quite a number of books and edited, together with colleagues of different kinds, for me, very interestingly, a rather complex and critical relationship to Deleuze, and not in the sense of being negative to Deleuzean thought, but complexifying and situating Deleuze thinking in regard of for example, conflict and war. But so maybe this is enough of an introduction, because we have to rush a little bit today because of Julian's train is coming to a halt sooner or later. So today I wanted to initially ask Julian around how he could consider and think around relations in between contemporary internet-related technology and indigenous populations, both then in regard to Finland and the northern Finland with Sapmi people and so on, but also in regard to, of course, Nanaimo and the indigenous population on Vancouver Island. What do you say, Julian?
Well, big question. I guess, I mean, when we say indigenous peoples and technology, I think we tend to assume that these are two different worlds, right? So we associate technology, technological innovation, the dynamism of the story of the West and with civilization. And on the other hand, we think of, or we're taught to think anyway, of indigenous peoples as, existence of time, free from that continuous technological change. Whereas I guess in my work, I've really been trying to complexify and challenge that kind of binary understanding of the distinction and conflict between indigenous culture and Western cultures. And so that's the first observation I would make, is that we don't actually know enough about the role of technology in indigenous cultures and societies. And take a classic example, like the technologies which make phenomenon like mining possible, right? So you're familiar with the fact that in Lapland and Arctic, in northern Sweden, northern Finland, you now have these political conflicts between mining corporations and the states, which support the activity of mining, and local populations, especially indigenous populations. And this is often represented in terms of a clash of cultures. You know, the indigenous peoples are said to have their way of life, which is antithetical to the ways of life and forms of thinking and very relationship with the world, which associate with the West and with modernity, with civilization. And then technologies of extraction. Extractivism is a big debate at the moment, politically, but also theoretically. But you know, the fact that developed the extraction of pigment from the ground in order to be able to dye clothing and faces and skin. This is, you know, the origins of technology are much more murky, much less clearly defined than they are presented as being in the dominant literatures and perspectives on what constitutes an indigenous people and its culture vis-a-vis a Western or colonial culture and its people. So yeah, I think it's very much up for debate and reconceptualization and thinking. The question of the relationship of indigeneity to technology. Of course, with the internet, there's a lot more to be said about this. I mean, in terms of social scientific literatures on indigeneity, there's a lot of enthusiasm for the way in which the internet, for example, can bridge the relationships between different indigenous peoples worldwide. So the gathering of something like a global indigenous movement and indigenous and technology, and these kinds of technologies, which themselves are, of course, the product of the West and even Western military reason and practice and needs. These technologies can be reappropriated and are being reappropriated by indigenous peoples worldwide to engineer and develop a different kind of politics and a different sensibility of relationship. So there's a lot also to be said there about the relationships of indigenous peoples to specifically digital technologies, information and communication technologies, maybe. But yeah, the general drive of my work has really been to challenge this binary construction of the conflict between indigeneity on the one hand and the West, the colonial West, on the other hand. I'm also very suspicious of the general enthusiasm today that we see in the West for an embrace of indigenous culture and indigenous epistemologies and indigenous ways of. There's a sense in which today is a resource for solutions to political and social crises which have been caused by the West. So the Anthropocene is the classic example, right? So the destruction of the earth, the crisis in human earth relationships, pressed through problem like climate change, for example. All of this has led to this new enthusiasm by adapting indigenous practices and human to the earth. And we see this producing, I'm sure you're familiar with this in dance and performance and choreography, right? We see this enthusiasm for including and enabling and also learning from and borrowing from indigenous peoples, which on the one hand is of course a good thing, you know, to the extent that those people are being marginal, excluded and persecuted historically, very cynical about the rationalities which are driving this perceived need to communicate and include and work together, and omnipresent, I think, today in the arts, in culture, in knowledge as well. You know, there's so much enthusiasm within my discipline, international relations, and the wider social science are full of theory and research, which is calling for and
now we have a slightly complex connection, but so get back to
knowledge. Which on the surface of things would sound really progressive, and we lose our connection.
Yeah, now you're back again. Now you're back. Okay. But I mean, there is a few years ago, resilience was a word that showed up, and it had oftentimes it was understood as something very positive, that we need to be resilient in regard to global warming. We need to be resilient to contemporary job opportunities, and particularly, maybe I could think that what was once called the precariat became the new resilient in a way, that we should become docile to whatever environments that we were around. But then the flip side then, of course, could also be maybe traced back to a kind of a Thatcherism where there's an idea of there's no such thing as the society anymore, but now you're on your own. So don't expect governments and so on to cater for your needs. And the peculiar connection there was in regard to resilient to indigenous populations that was sort of then brought as examples for those, look, in regard to their resilience, how well they have managed their lives and their tribes to thrive over centuries and even millennia. You spend quite a lot of time thinking around resilience. Can you give us a little bit of an understanding of what that work was around?
I think this is really crucial. I think it's also really relevant to the arts. For so years, we've seen this gradual developing enthusiasm in policy and in knowledge concerning the inner resilience of human life and human beings and human capacities. States and governments have been really proactive in supporting knowledge, the production of knowledge, and new policies which will work to enhance the inner resilience of whole communities, whole populations, whole peoples. In my work, I took an interest in this from the very beginning that I started to see it happening, going back to like the first decade of the 2000s. I started to pick up on this new concept of resilience, how it was being talked about at the state level in policy, and then also in knowledge. And I was really interested in understanding what work this concept of resilience was performing, why it was that states and governments were suddenly talking about resilience in a way that they used to talk historically about security. So, security is the fundamental attribute of a strong and powerful and successful state, right? Has been historically, go back to the 17th century, even Thomas Hobbes and Leviathan, and it's understood that for a state to be successful, it has to be able to achieve security for its people. It has to be able to secure people from threats like war and disease and poverty. And this continued to be the case more or less up until the end of the 20th century, end of the Cold War and beyond. And then suddenly, around the year 2000, we start to see governments talking less and less about security and more about this thing called resilience. And so originally I was interested in what this was about and what it meant. And pretty quickly I realized that what they meant when they talked about resilience was something very different to what they talked about in terms of security. So when states and governments talk about resilience, what they're really saying is that, it's not our job to secure people, from threats like war or disease. Rarely is understood to be one of enabling people to become resilient to these, being resilient to poverty, being resilient to disease, being resilient to war, essentially means people have to be able to prepare themselves these kinds of habits, to say that we are not responsible for you. We're not responsible for you. If Russia attacks and invades tomorrow, you better be ready and able to be resilient, because we can't set kind of pandemic. When resilience is the governing framework, what the state is saying is, you know what, we can't do anything to prevent this disease from impacting upon you. Likewise with poverty, when the state talks about making people resilient to poverty, what it's saying is that we can't secure you from poverty, from the threat of poverty. All we can do is enable you to be resilient to the impact of poverty on your life. So in other words, it's the neoliberal discourse, which goes back, as you rightly say, to the 1980s, to Thatcherism, and this idea of I'm all right, Jack, I can survive regardless of what happens to me. And what's really important here, and the connection here with indigeneity, is that Western states and governments, even wholesale international organizations like the United Nations, the IMF, the World Bank, they're all really interested in using indigenous peoples as a kind of model from which they can extract knowledge concerning resilience and then apply it and transfer it to regular Western civilization. So the argument goes that, hey, if we want to make people resilient in the future, we have a lot to learn from indigenous peoples, because they are the ultimate resilient subjects. You know, they survived colonialism, they survived genocide, they've survived all of this, and they even know how to survive climate change and the Anthropocene. In other words, they are model subjects when it comes to resilience. So in Western social science today, there's huge enthusiasm for indigenous resilience, right? So the indigenous are seen to be the ultimate resilient subjects from which the West can learn and adopt practices and knowledge and redevelop its culture in order to be essentially good neoliberal subjects of the future, subjects which don't need state and governmental support, which know how to survive in the context of whatever crisis it is that happens to be hitting and happening at the time. So yeah, I think this notion of indigenous resilience is really dangerous and damaging. It's damaging to the indigenous themselves, because it demands so much of them, and it also exoticizes and romanticizes their histories, which have been histories of struggle and immense suffering in the context of Western colonization. And it's also which now has to learn to become indigenous in a certain sense, and to do that, accept the notion that states and governments will no longer provide them with security. So it's a way of lessening, reducing our political expectations and the kinds of demands that we can make on political power. It's also a way of normalizing crisis and normalizing suffering and normalizing damage and trauma. Of course, resilience is also a concept which is very, very big in psychology and in psychiatry, and also in neurobiology, right? So the neurobiologists are, you know, they're so into this concept of resilience and trying to understand the biological sources. The neurobiologist is more resilient than another person's brain. What makes one human body more able to bear the impact of trauma and, you know, PTSD and all these things, and successfully on the other side, whereas another person doesn't in a healthy way. These right at this moment in 2024, the neurobiologists are going wild with this as a research topic. There's a lot of neurobiology around resilience, and it's actually focused on this one hormone known as oxytocin, right? Probably we've all heard something today about oxytocin, even if it's just the a song by Billie Eilish, she has this track called Oxytocin. It was a big hit in, I think, 2009. Increase our resilience by increasing our oxytocin biologically. This is stuff which we all have. It's in our bloodstreams, it's in our brains. And the neurobiologists are just beginning to establish how we manipulate oxytocin, through just hit the oxytocin of someone on the world and make them instantly more able to cope and bounce back from traumatic events. So I'm sure that we're going to see all of this technologized in the future. But yeah, to come back to this indigenous resilience question, I've been very interested actually in how indigenous resilience has become a kind of attractor for funding in the arts and in performance. In Canada, for example, so you're working now, I learned, with a choreography space in Vancouver, or just off Vancouver. But a few years ago, I was watching how the Canadian state was starting to, which were working nominally to support Indigenous artists and Indigenous arts, but in ways that always tended to play into this lens and this discourse of resilience. So Canadian art bodies, for example, were given a lot of funding to support Indigenous artists, but the work, which would be about resilience in one way or another. So the politics of this is really pernicious, I think, but in ways that we're not automatically aware of or is automatically obvious. I'm sure that the curators in Canada who were given the money to make work about Indigenous resilience weren't aware of the dangers and the difficulties of this concept, the coloniality actually of the concept. So I think it's something that's really important for us to raise awareness of in the arts, political art can be without necessarily understanding itself as being political. Or, of course, all art is political, but often we're looking at art which understands itself as working for progressive and decolonizing ambitions, looked at more closely and more deeply, reveals itself to be fundamentally neoliberal, are a really good example of that.
No, indeed. I experience this as a very strong, very complex problematics that we are occupied with now, and that it often comes from politicians addressing art councils with perspectives that are very, very naive and banal, where maybe art councils and curators and artists has no choice but to cater for this naivete. Otherwise, you just have to stop working, basically. Or, of course, there are also intelligent proposals are coming back to in these directions. But I have a related question. There is something peculiar here, is that on the one hand, concerning indigenous populations, that on the one hand, we see stronger relations or interest in indigenous populations in regard to resilience. But at the same time, indigenous populations are also speaking from positions of authenticity, which seems to be something that contemporary culture are very, very occupied with. So do you see a connection in between resilience and authenticity in regard to indigenous populations?
That's a big question. Yeah, you're right, of course, that there tends to be this assumption that there is an authenticity to indigenous culture. This goes back to our discussion about the binary distinction between the West civilization and the indigenous on the other hand. So we tend to start from the assumption that the West is inauthentic, right? It has no concept of authenticity. The West is a thoroughly technologized subject, which has learned how to produce and reproduce itself, and how to work upon itself in production of ever increasing a number of changing forms. So there's an inherent not just dynamism but inauthenticity to the West as a set and history of cultural experiences and productions and performances. We understand the Western subject as being inherently performative, while the indigenous subject is represented and discursively constituted as authentic, as non-produced, as non-technologized, as being simply as close to nature as you possibly can get, right? This is today the dominant depiction of the indigenous subject is that form of human subject which exists as close to nature as one can possibly be, even in the realm of culture. So we talk about indigenous culture, but indigenous cultures are always understood as what are called by the anthropologists, like De Schola, nature cultures, right? So culture and nature are not seen as two separate things, as they have come to be separated in the history of Western and modern civilization, but as two impossibly intertwined phenomena, such that you cannot distinguish between nature and culture when looking at indigenous peoples. This is the fundamental thesis of the famous French anthropologist Philippe de Schola, whose work in anthropology has had massive impact on wider sciences. And I think that it's from that perspective, or that way of understanding indigeneity, that this concept of indigenous resilience actually flows. Because what is it to be resilient? It's to be it's to understand and to embody the fundamental laws of biological life. If we ask the question, what is it? If we ask Spinoza's question, what is it to be a living thing? What is it to be alive at source? I mean, we know that Spinoza has these answers in the 17th century, but the philosophers and the anthropologists and the ecologists today all answer that what it is to be alive and to live is to be resilient. Resilience is seen as the fundamental ontology of life today. This was the main claim of an ecologist, very famous ecologist from the 1960s and 1970s. His name was C.S. Holling. He became the grand theorist of resilience over time. He was a Canadian ecologist, all of whose research was actually about forests. His big interest in his question was, why is it that a forest is able to cope and bounce back from a major disaster like a forest fire? What is it? Why is it that forests always seem to grow back bigger and stronger when they are hit by fires? And his answer was that the forest is the ultimate embodiment of a living system. And living systems are, by their nature, always resilient. The closer you are to the laws of life, the more able you are to be resistant at its essence, right? And we in the West, because we are seen to have become detached from those fundamental biological laws which govern the existence and emergence and development of living systems, we're really bad at resilience. We've lost touch with those laws culturally and epistemologically, whereas the indigenous, it's argued, embody those laws and understand those laws. Their philosophies, their cosmologies, their cultures, their systems of knowledge, maybe even their neurobiology. I'm not sure about that. I haven't had time yet to really get into the question of what does neurobiology say about the biological resilience of the indigenous body and the neurobiology of indigenous people. That's something which someone should definitely be researching, and maybe I'll have time to do it myself soon. But it seems to me that this concept of indigenous resilience flows perfectly from the underlying assumption of the authenticity, the naturalness of the indigenous subject, in contrast with the inauthenticity and overproduced nature, performative nature of the Western subject, which has lost touch with its inner resilience, inner nature. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, completely, absolutely. No, and it maybe also brings us to something that has occupied me is what are the consequences of a performative subject, and how to deal with them. Recently, Judith Butler published a book called "Who's Afraid of Gender," where she strongly where she reacts onto how the populist right has sort of hijacked identity politics and gender in favor of arguing for the authenticity of the nuclear family, for a re-binarization of man and woman, and so on and forth. But it is similarly complicated for me then to. My problem is not with identity, but the difficulty that I have is what are the consequences if performativity is regarded in respect of identity and personhood. What does that mean in regard to how we understand nature, or how we understand, in my particular interest, in the aesthetic encounter? And I find it quite complicated to experience how, on the one hand, how is identity politics and its expressions, say LGBTQ plus communities, how are they aware or not about how they are also playing into exactly the same kind of tonalities as neoliberal forms of resilience? And simultaneously, are very oftentimes speaking around sort of, but I have always experienced that I was living in the wrong body. I needed to find my genuine self, which is paradoxical in regard to the propositions of Butler and identity politics in general. So there is a very peculiar tension in between performativity, identity, and authenticity and resilience here. That I find very complex and difficult to, and it's also difficult to talk about, because you can very easily be understood as then either, right wing or colonial or what have we, no?
Yeah, that's right. Joanne Greer, the old feminist, I mean, she said it many years ago, very pointedly, like, how do you
Yes, you have, again, one more time, please.
That you are this other that you think you are. Right, the Butler, I'm not reading perfectly, in terms of the gender body debates, trans debate. She said it many years ago. It's frustrating, isn't it, that you would think that someone like Butler, she should be perfectly positioned to say something really eloquent and interventional in this context, but I haven't heard anything from her, and I stopped reading her work a long time ago, actually, at least 10 years ago. Just it seemed to me that there was just from the work in the 1990s, which was really good. It was like it was right at the cutting edge at the time in terms of gender and embodiment and performativity, and I take my hat off to Butler for those. The brilliance of her work in the 1990s. But after that, it just seemed to go further and further downhill. From precarious life, and then the work on vulnerability. She just seemed to become a voice box for a really weak version of neoliberalism, actually. And,
no, I think some 15 years ago there was sort of a cutting edge news that, oh my lord, also war strategists were using Mille Plateau as their textbook for for neoliberal warfare, and that was understood as terrifying. But I have a feeling that with Butler, we understood too late that Butler's theories around performativity and the subject was also extremely attractive for business. So at the same time as Butler writes about or gender trouble is published, that's the moment where post-Fordism is at its sort of a turning point. So of course, performativity became an excellent selling point for a lot of money making. And if we can see this to say, 20th century was about stuff. 21st century is about movement, and that falls perfectly into Butler's thought.
Yeah.
So I think that maybe how I would articulate it is that she had to become a defender of her own work, but on other people. But she's always playing on other people's turfs, and I mean that with a U and not an E, you know. And it is a terrible destiny for her, in the sense of how her work became so misread and so superficially understood. I think that she is also an extremely good, maybe not an extremely good philosopher, but she's an extremely good scholar in finding ways of associating thought from different register. So for sure. But before you have to jump off the train, or maybe we should have a second session, because I would also be very happy to talk with you about relationships in between what we have talked about today, social media, and in particular in respect to artificial intelligence. But I know that your train is coming to a halt in 3 minutes, so maybe we will have to do this in a second session, maybe next week or so. What do you think?
I would really enjoy that. That would be a great pleasure.
Righto, and we had a slightly ridiculous connection.
Let's continue this. I feel like we're just getting started, really. And maybe next time we can do it.
Standing still. Righto. You have been a little bit blurry, not in your arguments, but in your visual representation has been a little bit fussy, so to say the least. But anyways, take care of business and enjoy the nature in the Finnish countryside. And we'll get in touch next week and see what we can talk about in prolongation to this. Thank you very much, Julian. And I'll be seeing you.
Thank you.
Okay. Ciao, ciao. Bye.